Hello, everyone. Welcome to Luohan webinar. Today, we are very happy to have Dr. Liam Musov. Dr. Musov received his PhD from Princeton. His research concentrates on empirical industrial organization, especially e-commerce and multi-sided markets. Dr. Musov will join University of Pennsylvania Wharton School as an assistant professor after a postdoc at Microsoft Research. Today, he's going to talk about the impact of platform-guided search on consumer welfare through the angle of seller entry. The title of the paper is Entry into Two-Sided Markets Shaped by Platform-Guided Search. So Dr. Musov, the presentation is 90 minutes. The floor is yours. Yeah, please go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sangwoo, and thank you to both the organizers and all the attendees for having me. I'm really excited to present this research. This is my job market paper, and just to flag, this is joint work with Kwok-Hao Lee, who's just in the year below me at Princeton. That means he's on the market this year. So that's just something I always emphasize. Okay, but without further ado, let me go back to when I started this project. The other day, I needed to purchase a new water bottle. So I went to the usual suspects, the e-commerce apps on my phone. And if I was in China, Alibaba would have been on the slide, but I'm in the United States, so I put eBay and Amazon there. I typed in the words water bottle, and this is what I saw. Note on the left-hand side how eBay actually tells you it has more than 280,000 results for water bottles available. Now, I don't know about you, but even during a pandemic, I have better things to do with my time than to painstakingly evaluate 280,000 different water bottles. So it occurred to me that whatever water bottles eBay placed on this first page of search results, they were going to be much more likely to be evaluated by me and to be eventually bought by me. So more generally speaking, it seems that these search, ranking, and recommendation algorithms that e-commerce platforms use have an outsized influence over our eventual purchase decisions. Now, I'm hardly the first person to have noticed this. In fact, in 2018, in a report to the Stiegler Center at Chicago booth, economists noted that defaults can direct a consumer to the choice that is most profitable for the platform. And a following US Senate investigation of competition in digital markets put a rather finer point on it, noting that Amazon, specifically Amazon, can give itself favorable treatment relative to competing sellers. It has done so through its control over the buy box, which is just one of these search, ranking, and recommendation algorithms that we'll explore in much more detail later today. Now, before we go there, however, let me voice a competing viewpoint. A merchant selling on Amazon noted that Amazon seemed to rotate the buy box. They share out the recommendation and suggested that it might be to keep sellers from getting discouraged and leaving the site. So this is our first indication that recommendation algorithms and entry incentives might interact in a rather interesting way. Now, today, I want to ask and answer two questions, and I will examine these questions in the context of Amazon and Amazon Marketplace. But I do hope that the results I find allow us to make some more general conclusions about the marketplace design of e-commerce platforms in general. Now, the first question I want to ask is, what is the effect of search guidance? To answer this question, we will need to examine the interplay between Amazon's need to attract merchants and its ability to guide consumer search. Now, the key trade-off facing the platform will be that between creating competition, thereby lowering prices and attracting consumers, and making sure that merchants have adequate entry incentives. Without those entry incentives, the assortment on the platform will be small and consumers will not be attracted to it after all. In our structural estimation, we will find that in the short run, there is a major $51 billion consumer surplus gain from search guidance. However, in the long run, merchants re-optimize their entry decisions. And because the main effect of search guidance in our estimates is to make competition on the platform starker, to increase the intensity of price competition, that increase leads to a reduction in surplus for sellers And that reduction in surplus for sellers leads to a reduction in entry. So we will find that in the long run, this $51 billion consumer surplus gain is offset down to only $1 billion by a reduction in entry brought about by the search guidance.
Hi, Leo.
Yes.
So this gain in consumer surplus is due to variety. That's
no, it's mostly due to consumers facing lower prices due to search guidance and being guided to the right products. So you can imagine that if I only evaluate one product, if it's a bad price, for instance, then that's not good for me.
Yeah, but the products are quite differentiated, right? So, yeah, I mean, the products are quite differentiated. So what's the kind of best product for me may not be the best product for others, then I think it will be hard to evaluate directly, right?
That's right. Here, search guidance will be within a product to an offer. So it will be much easier to evaluate because it will generally be like the cheapest offer will be the best offer for you. But okay. Yeah, thank you. That was a good point. Okay, so the second question I want to investigate today is what is the effect of self-preferencing? The regulatory concern here is that firms which participate on their own platforms make revenue both from intermediation fees, but also from their own sales. And these firms may thus be tempted to self-preference. That is, they may be tempted to guide consumers preferentially towards their own offers. Several theories of harm have been advanced in this context, but a key theory is that self-preferencing could act as a barrier to entry, effectively depriving consumers of choice in the long run as merchants opt not to join a platform that will just divert demand away from them. Empirically speaking, however, we actually find no harm and instead a $5 billion consumer surplus gain from self-preferencing. And this is because in our estimates, consumers prefer the platform's offers over offers by third-party merchants for these same products. And you might think that that is because the platform has better shipping and handling, or that returns are easier, or that this is just a brand effect. Now, we also go further and we explicitly examine this barrier to entry theory, analyzing what reduction in entry there is going to be due to self-preferencing. And again, we find that the reduction exists. It almost must exist, just theoretically speaking, but it is very small, on the order of 0.01 merchants per product. And finally, these results do come with a major caveat, which is that we do not model Amazon's pricing decision. For it seems to us, at least, that historically Amazon has not been setting prices to maximize short-run profits. Now, if Amazon were to raise prices due to self-preferencing by more than 7.8%, then our results would flip and there would be harm to consumers.
Let me ask you a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the kind of definition of self-preferencing here? Because you said that customers prefer platforms offer maybe because of the brand effect. So is the definition of self-preferencing is even though the products are exactly the same, Amazon is recommending its own products?
That's correct, yeah. Even though the offers will be at the offer level, I'll explain in a second, but even though the offers are exactly the same, Amazon is giving it, basically Amazon's going to end up giving itself a pricing advantage. So even though the Amazon offer is slightly more expensive, it's going to be recommended. And you are right to say that there is sort of a tension between definitions of self-preferencing. Other people sometimes think of self-preferencing as relative to consumer preferences. In that sense, we will, I guess, find that there is no self-preferencing here. Amazon is giving itself an advantage, but it's less strong than the advantage it has at consumer preferences.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Perfect. So the agenda for today's talk is as follows. I will begin by introducing the setting and providing some descriptive statistics. Then together, we will build a novel structural model of intermediation power, where by intermediation power, I just mean the platform's ability to steer consumer decisions by choosing the consumer's consideration sets, a la Guri 2008. In our structural model, firms make an entry decision. Successful entrants are going to choose prices. The platform is going to recommend some offers over others, and finally, consumers are going to make their choice. We will then take our structural model and estimate it on extensive proprietary data. We will estimate demand and recommendations using a maximum likelihood approach and fixed and unit costs using a simulated method of moments procedure. Just as a preview of our results, we will find that Amazon indeed has intermediation power, as at least 26% of consumers consider only the recommended offer and no other offer. And it uses this power both to intensify price competition, increasing the demand elasticity from around -3 to around -4, and finally to self-preference, giving itself a recommendation advantage that's roughly equivalent to pricing 9% cheaper. Now, just to be clear, Amazon for sure would say that this is not true self-preferencing because Amazon is just advantaging itself based on some observables that they have access to that I don't have access to. And I agree with this interpretation. There are many things about offers which I don't observe, which might legitimately influence recommendation status and consumer preferences. And that is exactly why I then go on to estimate consumer preferences for Amazon offers. And I do find that consumers strongly prefer Amazon offers. So that's consistent with this interpretation. I just wanted to be clear about that. Finally, we will use this model to evaluate the effect of self-preferencing and the effect of search guidance, finding the results on the previous slide. Just as a quick reminder, self-preferencing seems to actually raise consumer welfare here, and search guidance also raises consumer welfare, but by much less once we take into account the entry effect. Now, if there are no questions at this point, let me delve straight into the setting, and I think that's going to clarify a lot of the setup. So the setting is Amazon Marketplace, which I think is a website we all know. If you don't know it, it's a big e-commerce website in the US. It's a place where third parties can co-list right alongside Amazon's offers. And in fact, even though it started as a direct retailer, Amazon selling its own products, now about 60% of sales are sales of items that were co-listed on the website by third-party sellers. And they generated an estimated $25 billion in third-party profits in 2020. So this third-party component is a large part of the platform. Now, if you were to go to Amazon, I showed you earlier this picture of my ill-fated search for water bottles. If you type in water bottle on the mobile app, this is more or less what you see. And I do think that the search algorithm that determines the rankings in response to this water bottle query is probably the most influential algorithm determining consumer choices. Sadly, it is also an algorithm that is extremely hard to get data for. And even if you have data, it's very hard to analyze because these products differ in ways that are unobservable to the econometrician. And you're going to have to control for these differences when analyzing these recommendations. So rather than focus on the search algorithm, let us click on one of these products here, and then we arrive on a product page. If you scroll down a little bit, it looks like this. Essentially, I've scrolled past all the product details to where I have these large add to cart and buy now buttons. Now, if you click either of these buttons, Amazon is going to choose which offer you are actually purchasing. Hold on, you say, what do you mean, which offer I'm purchasing? Well, actually, for each product on Amazon, there's typically multiple offers. So here we see there is about 7 offers for this particular product. And if you click add to cart or buy now, you're never confronted with a choice of which offer to buy. Amazon has already chosen that. And the algorithm that chooses this is the so-called buy box algorithm. Why is it called the buy box? Well, on the desktop, the whole thing looks like this. There is a box around an area that has a big buy now button in it. So that is called the buy box algorithm. So just to be clear, the buy box algorithm is what I'm going to refer to as the recommendation algorithm in the rest of this talk, trying to keep the terminology a little bit more general. And what it's doing is it's mapping a list of offers for the very same product into the identity of a recommended offer. So you're going to get the exact same product, no matter which of these offers you purchase from, which is why Amazon can hide this choice from you, right? But there is still ways in which these offers might differ. For instance, the price might differ, the shipping speed might differ, the quality, like the star rating of the merchant that you're buying from, all of these are things that might differ. I like to think of this setup as econometrician's paradise, because it gives me an incredibly clean market definition. For sure, there is substitution across product pages on Amazon, but also even more clearly, my main competitor, the competitor I'm most worried about, is going to be the other merchant that lists on exactly the same product page and that thus competes with me for the buy box. And the second part of this academician's paradise claim is that here product characteristics cancel, right? Product characteristics on online marketplaces are incredibly complex because there is so many products. I've heard recent estimates that there's more than 100 million different products on Amazon. Controlling for these is hard for an academician. So in this setting, I don't have to because the product characteristics are all going to cancel in my choice between various offers for the same product. Now yes.
Can I ask you a question? So those products are exactly the same.
Yes.
So it seems like so can I understand that the products from the same factory, but they just have a different retailer, something like that? So
yeah, I would say so. I mean, I don't know from the same factory, right? Many products are produced in
they're exactly the same.
Yeah, I would think of this exactly as retailers, right? There's multiple retailers buying the same product and then selling it to you. Yeah. So we're going to tackle this using novel high-frequency, high-fidelity data that I sourced from a company which reprices listings on behalf of third parties. That means I have a panel of around 200,000 products that I observe over around 450 days. And for these products, I have prices, I have recommendations, I have sales ranks, and crucially, for what may be the first time, at least across a large variety of merchants on Amazon, I actually have sales. Now, to temper our excitement a little bit, the model at the moment is quite computationally demanding, and so we're going to focus on just all the products in the fashion category, but I hope to expand it to all products in subsequent work. Now, the first question I had when seeing this data, probably the first question you have, is, well, what actually determines recommendation status? Is it just that the cheapest offer is always recommended? I mean, that's interesting, but maybe not quite enough for a paper, right? So I went digging. And what I'm showing you on the left-hand side here is that price matters. On the x-axis, we see the price rank of an offer. So that's the cheapest offer on a product, the second cheapest, and so on. And on the y-axis, I'm showing you the fraction of the time that these offers are actually recommended. So we see that the cheapest offer is recommended the lion's share of the time, around 55 to 60%. But the second cheapest offer, the third cheapest offer, all of these still have positive recommendation share, which is to say that it's not just price that matters. Now, if it's not just price that matters, what else is there? Well, just one of these variables is feedback count, and I've plotted this over here. Now, to read this graph, you will have to indulge me for a second and assume that there is a causal interpretation to the underlying regression, and I will address potential endogeneity later. But if we assume that there is a causal interpretation, then you can imagine being a small seller that has maybe 20 reviews on their seller page. And now you work for years and you build up a reputation and you have now 100,000 reviews on your seller page. If you do this, then you can increase your price by around 2.5% and still be recommended the same frequency as before. So this is the sense in which the recommendation algorithm will reward sellers who have high reputation. Now we can briefly look at some other characteristics. You know, if the feedback you get is actually good as opposed to bad, that's also going to be helpful. You can also increase your price a little bit. Now I would note that the x-axis here is rather cut off because if you have too much bad feedback, what will happen is just the platform will ban you. So, you know, that data doesn't exist. And then secondly, if you take a long time to ship your product, you are going to really have to cut your price to be recommended the same frequency. In particular here, 96 hours, if you take 4 days to ship your product, you will have to cut your price by around 11% to be recommended the same frequency as someone who ships their product instantly. So this is the sense in which shipping speed also really matters. And we can get a bit of an overview of all of these effects by looking at this table where we can go look what if you go from the first percentile on a certain characteristic to the 99th percentile, by how much can you raise your price afterwards? And here we see that, you know, using fulfillment by Amazon, you can raise your price quite a bit because I guess the fulfillment is going to be a lot better. This is arguably metaphysically challenging, but if you become Amazon, then you can also raise your price by 9%. So I'm going to refer to this as self-preferencing. And that's an effect that happens over and above the FBA effect. The feedback count I just showed you, the positive feedback I also just showed you, and the hours to dispatch. So this is our initial analysis of the recommendation algorithm. Now, if there are no questions about the recommendation algorithm's descriptive statistics, I'm going to go into the model, but I want to give you a chance to ask questions at this point, because I know that was a lot of graphs.
Yeah. Quick question. So can you go back one slide about that table?
Oh, to the table. Yes, of course.
So that is Amazon, the second line, the 9% stuff is like on top of the FBA.
Yes.
Okay, that's interesting. Because what I guessed, what I imagined is, if you actually already FBA in Amazon, all the logistics are kind of the same as Amazon products, I guess, right? But
that's right. And
yeah, so even after that, you still have 9% of this effect. Okay. And is this Amazon products is like a private level brand or just first party? So
first party sales of the same products. Okay. Right, because no third party can sell an Amazon private label brand, so they're not in our data.
Okay, yeah, thank you. It's really interesting.
Sure.
Yeah, maybe let me follow up on Sang-Woo's point. So, so here in the third row, I think if you kind of increase the feedback count from 1 to like 179,000, the effect is very small. So it means that the algorithm does not really kind of matter, does not really take that into account, right?
I don't know about not really take it into account, right? This is very precisely estimated, actually.
Yeah, but actually, if you have a very large kind of, let's say, customer base or kind of the reviews, cumulative reviews, but then in that case, you still can only increase the price by 2.5%. So
that's right. The effect is, I would say, it's like economically not very large, but it's very precisely estimated. Yeah. I agree with that. I think that's sort of reasonable in the sense that you have to be providing exactly the same product. If you don't, if it gets found out that you were not providing exactly the same product, you will probably get banned from the platform. So in that sense, these reputation mechanisms aren't as important as they might be on other platforms, right? Because it only ever happens like 5 times that you lie about what product you're providing, and then you're off the platform. So I think that's what's going on here.
Yeah, then it means that there's a very kind of strict entry rule, right? If that's not the case, then the information friction is going to be so large, then this feedback information will be very valuable for the customer.
I think that's right. And I think part of the reason for this is that, at least for the FBA sellers, the inventory actually gets commingled. And with commingled inventory, you can't have it otherwise, right? Because otherwise, I might be buying from Sang-Woo and I get Xiji's product and it's low quality, and then that somehow gets attributed to Sang-Woo. So we can't have that. We have to have a really strict entry rule.
Okay.
Awesome. So at this point, then let's go straight into the model. And just from bird's eye perspective, this is going to be the model that we're working with. There is an entry stage. Successful entrants then make a pricing decision. The pricing decision is going to influence both recommendation status and consumer choice. And finally, that's right, consumers make their choice, taking into account both prices and the recommendation. And we're going to assume that this model plays out in parallel across many, many markets. And just to flag right now, even though it won't play a major role during the discussion of the model, a market is going to be a product page on a certain date. So there is an underlying assumption here, which is that there is not too much substitution across the products that we observe. This is quite plausible because of the way our products are sampled. They're essentially almost a random sample of products on Amazon. So it's not like we observe all kind of black socks in one category where there might be a lot of cross substitution, but we observe one sock and then one scarf and so on and so forth. Now, let's start at the bottom of this model with consumer choice. Consumer choice is going to be the most standard model you can think of, a loaded choice model a la McFadden. So given a market T, consumers are going to face some alternatives that include the outside option, which we indicate by 0. And the outside option here is not purchasing this particular product on Amazon. It could include purchasing a different product on Amazon. It could include purchasing this product off Amazon. Now, each alternative has some observed characteristics, xJT, like for instance, the feedback count, and unobserved xijT, which is meant to model sort of seller brand effects, and a price pJT. And they combine in the usual linear fashion to give a mean utility delta JT, which when shocked with a gumball shock gives us the VIJTs, the personalized utilities for consumer I on a product or a choice J on market T. And these VIJTs are what underlie choice. Now, here comes the twist. We're going to introduce consideration sets into this model. And here I just want to flag that this idea is one that's been advanced by Dynasty et al. 2018, who did this in sort of a buy box-like examination on eBay. And the idea is that one alternative, JRT, is going to be the recommended alternative. And here the interpretation of that is very easy, right? It's going to be the buy box alternative. It's going to be the one that happens when you click buy now. A fraction row of consumers are going to be sophisticated, and they will completely ignore this recommendation. And the idea is these sophisticated consumers, they essentially click through to that listing of all the offers. I didn't show you this, but if you click under the buy box, you can see a listing of all the offers, and then they can read through it and make their choice. However, a fraction 1 minus row of consumers are going to be naive. And these naive consumers, they will only consider the recommended offer as well as the outside option. So it's as if they don't know that this link exists, right? And you can think of this as a little bit of a reduced form search model. And I should flag later how the fact that this is a reduced form search model, right? I'm not modeling the cost of clicking the link, might have some implications on how you interpret my counterfactuals. And if I don't flag it, please feel free to ask. I might just run out of time. Okay, so with this model, what are going to be our market shares? Our market shares are going to be the following. Well, a fraction row of consumers is sophisticated. And for the sophisticated consumers, we get our usual sum of exponentials formula for the loaded choice. However, a fraction 1 minus row of consumers are naive. And these naive consumers, they can only choose offers which are recommended. So the first item, the first term here is going to be the probability that this particular alternative J is actually recommended. When it is recommended, consumers can choose this alternative and they choose between it and the outside option. And the outside option has the utility normalized at 0. So the exponent of 0, exponential of 0 is 1. So that gives us this formula here. Now, what about recommendations? Well, for recommendations, we're going to use the observation that a recommendation essentially is a discrete choice just on the part of the platform. So the discrete choice doesn't get repeated across many, many consumers. It's only made once per market. And here, remember that market is a product page date. So when I say once per market, that still means it can vary over time. And in particular, what we're going to estimate here is a nested logit model. So for each market T, the platform is going to choose one offer to recommend, JRT. And the platform also can choose not to recommend any option. And this is actually something that we see in the data. And that sort of motivated this analysis because in a pure, short run analysis, this makes no sense. If you recommend no option, we verify in the data, that's bad for you in the sense that there's going to be less sales because consumers are a bit scared away. They're used to buying via this recommendation. However, of course, in a dynamic setting, this might create pricing pressure. For instance, if you say, oh, I just don't recommend uncompetitively priced offers, then maybe all the merchants will now lower their prices so they get this recommendation. And that's sort of what we check in the data. That seems to be the main incentive here. Now, this is going to be a nested logit. And that means that we have one nest for the outside option and another nest for all the inside options. And the idea here is that the inside options are just going to be better substitutes for each other than the outside option. From the platform's perspective, this is pretty obvious. I don't really care whether you're buying from Sangwoo or Chiji, but if you don't buy, then I don't make an intermediation fee, right? Whereas the prices between the two of you are probably not going to differ that much. It's not going to impact my intermediation fee that much. So this is a nested logit, and this just gives us the standard nested logit choice probabilities that I've depicted here, but I don't think we really have to go through. Now, on a sort of post-job market note, you might notice that this is a nested logit, and on the previous page, this wasn't a nested logit, and that's mostly for computational convenience at the moment. I would like to make consumer choice also a nested logit, because similar concerns apply for the consumers, but I do have to find pricing equilibria, and pricing equilibria get a little bit finicky if you throw too complicated a consumer choice model at that. So that's on my to-do list. Now, moving one step up in the model, let's go to the pricing stage. Now, here we have to make a couple of key assumptions. We will assume that firms are single alternative firms. This is actually a very good assumption if you look at the data. What this means here is just that each firm only has one offer on a product. And you sometimes see firms having multiple offers on the same product, but those seem to be quite rare. And if they exist, they are kind of a poor man's repricing algorithm, right? You want to sell one unit at this price, and then if that unit sells, maybe there was a high demand shock, and then you want to sell the second unit or something at a higher price. That's quite rare. So single alternative firms is a good assumption, I think. The second assumption is constant marginal costs, which we're going to interpret as wholesale costs. So most of these firms are retailers, not producers. So they actually purchase the product. And what matters here is that these are quite small retailers on average. And because they're small retailers, there's not a lot of quantity discounting or negotiating going on. So these firms, they really face like a linear pricing schedule when they purchase these products. And so we can model this as constant marginal costs. Now, these firms, the successful entrants, they're playing a Nash-Bertrand pricing game. So in this game, the type of a firm is going to be given by its marginal cost, all these characteristics like what's the number of feedback that the firm had and so on, and the unobservables. And I've separated out here unobservables for the demand and unobservables for the recommendations. The firms are going to simultaneously choose prices to solve a standard profit maximization problem, taking everyone else's prices as given. And there's just sort of two things that change from the normal Nash-Bertrand game here. The first one is that the platform gets a share of revenue phi, that's the intermediation fee. I believe it's around 15% in practice. And the second one is that the share of demand that the firms get is going to depend on the recommendation. So in particular, if I'm a merchant, I might think, okay, if there wasn't a buy box, I wouldn't lower my price right now because consumers are not that price elastic. But there is a buy box. And so I really gain from being shown to these naive consumers who will only consider me and the outside option. So I should lower my price a little bit so that I get into the buy box and I'm shown to these consumers. And that comes through the fact that these SJs depend on the recommendation. And then finally, there is the entry game that sits on top of all of this. And just to be clear, this is kind of the methodological, I hesitate to call it innovation, but this hasn't been combined. These models haven't been combined before. And I sort of picked a specific entry model to make this combination a bit easier so that we can look at the entry channel. So each market T has a set of potential entrants, call it script NT, and an associated fixed cost FT. And we're going to assume in particular that the fixed cost FT does not vary across merchants and is publicly known. So now we're going to make some key assumptions here. The first one is that these markets are separable. No merchant is considering entering on multiple markets at the same time. And if you don't like this assumption, you can also think of this as just that the merchant makes entry decisions market by market. So that means that the entry margin I'm going to examine is really more of a expand your products, expand the number of products that you're selling on Amazon margin, as opposed to the first start selling on Amazon entry margin. Now comes the big assumption. We're going to assume that the information set of a firm J is going to be given by this IJ thing here, which contains its own marginal cost and the publicly known fixed cost associated with the market. So that means in particular that firms don't know any information about other firms, so including marginal costs of other firms when making their entry decisions. They're oblivious to this. Now, that part of the assumption I actually think is pretty good. There's very high turnover on Amazon. So even though Sang-Woo is selling this particular kind of water bottle at the moment, I don't know that he's going to be the seller really that I'm going to be competing with on average if I enter this product, because Sang-Woo might run out of stock tomorrow and then he'll be replaced by another seller with a different marginal cost. So that means really heuristically at entry, I should be thinking about a random draw from the competitor distribution. And that's exactly what this assumption forces me to do. Now, the second part of this assumption is a bit harder to swallow. And it's mostly for computational convenience. And that is that we assume that firms don't know their own vertical characteristics when they make their entry decision. And you could argue that this is actually plausible because the vertical characteristics mostly matter for the recommendation algorithm, and they might not know how, like, which vertical characteristics the recommendation algorithm cares about and how much. But generally speaking, this is going to lead us to slightly overstate for instance, the welfare loss if we have a reduction in entry, because we're going to find that we have a reduction in entry that's a random draw across the quality distribution, when really it should be the worst quality entrants that we lose. So that's just something to flag. Okay, then we will assume that firms play a symmetric equilibrium, and all of these assumptions together buy us a very nice structure of equilibrium, which is that firms will enter if and only if their marginal cost draw is sufficiently low, where sufficiently low is determined on a market-by-market basis with a market-specific cost cutoff C star T. And for instance, all the comparative statics you would think apply to this thing. So for instance, if a market is larger, it will support more entrants. So it will support, for instance, slightly worse entrants on the marginal cost basis. And crucially, at the end of the day, what this means is that the model allows for selection on cost. So in particular, one counterfactual we're going to want to run is we will want to examine what happens if you make the pricing as a recommendation algorithm more price elastic. And you might think that when the recommendation algorithm becomes more price elastic, prices will decrease, partially because the least effective firms, the least competitive firms will exit the market. And so the way we've built this model, the model can accommodate this. And that's rather crucial for our analysis. Any questions about the model before I move on to the empirical application?
Idea. So in the model, the only decision firm makes is to choose the price of the product, right?
Well, and an entry decision.
Yeah.
So you need to choose.
Entry,
yeah.
And then
yes.
So there's no marketing on the platform, and your
yes.
ranking now depend on this kind of thing, right?
Yeah, that's right. So marketing is interesting. I hadn't even thought of marketing before. I think that would be really hard for me to analyze because I have no data on it. Something that sometimes comes up is you could make, for instance, a choice between being fulfilled by Amazon and not being fulfilled by Amazon. And that's clearly, that's plausibly a choice players make. Here, it's an exogenous characteristic. So I'm sort of shutting down that channel. The problem really is, at the end of the day, this is already a very complicated model to simulate and match to the data. So adding another channel to it would be hard. But just from a theoretical perspective, I think this FBA concern is really interesting. In particular, you might think that one reason that there is such a high positive effect of having FBA on your recommendation status is because Amazon wants to incentivize merchants to choose FBA. And in fact, that was the core argument in a recent, I believe, Italian antitrust case against Amazon. So that's definitely something that people have considered. I do find it a bit hard because FBA really comes with tangible benefits for consumers that arguably merchants would be willing to pay quite a bit of money for. And when you talk to merchants, they typically say, actually, this FBA thing is sort of cheaper than getting the same thing from the postal service, say. So, and that's because Amazon has, of course, built up huge efficiencies in their warehouses. So it's a bit unclear whether this is really a problem from an antitrust perspective. But either way, I can't really add it to this model, but at least theoretically, you could see how it could be added.
Okay.
Okay, seeing no other questions. Also, always feel free to interrupt me with questions. Let us go to the estimation strategy. Now, let me start by reminding you of the data we're going to use and the market definition. So the data we will use is recommendations and third-party sales in the Amazon fashion category. Now, why fashion? Fashion happens to be where we have the most demand observations. So I wanted to make sure that we're powered for our demand analysis. Eventually, I would like to expand this to all the products that we observe, but that is going to take a little bit of time. Now, a market is going to be a tuple, a product page P on a date tau. And the alternatives are thus going to be offers for the very same product. And I just want to emphasize this here because this is really going to matter in demand estimation. The fact that these alternatives are going to be offers for the same product is going to give us a lot of leeway to deal with endogeneity or to be less worried about endogeneity in a second. Now, the first problem we confront is something that I call pooling. In particular, normally when you estimate IO-style models of demand, you have data that comes in one of the following two forms. Either your data is a repeat observation of the same market. So think the car market in 1989, the car market in 1990, and so on. Or you have data that is geographically distinct markets, but really for more or less the same product. The cereal market in Philadelphia and the cereal market in New York. Maybe not exactly the same products are on sale, but almost. Here, we have neither of these situations. In particular, if we look at two markets here, and we ignore the time dimension for now, if we look at two markets, they have none of the products in common, right? Or none of the alternatives in common, I should say. The alternatives here being offers. Because one market is various offers for a hat, and one market is various offers for a scarf. So this is not a huge issue, given that everything that's specific to the product, right, to the hat or to the scarf gets canceled in the choice. But what might matter is if consumers' preferences vary across markets, either because they just vary or because of selection concerns, right? You might think that more price-sensitive consumers elect into buying cheaper products on Amazon, say. Now, if I click on this here, basically, what we have done is we have allowed the recommendation and demand algorithm's price coefficient to vary by MSRP. MSRP is manufacturer's suggested retail price. And the idea is that this is sort of an exogenous source of information about a normal price level for this product. And the idea is that maybe you are more price sensitive for products that are cheaper. And that is exactly what we find in the data. So we basically find that for products with MSRP around $10, consumers are a lot more price sensitive. Oh, sorry, this is the recommendation algorithm. The recommendation algorithm is a lot more price sensitive than for products with a price around $90 or $100. And we find exactly the same thing for consumers. Full disclosure, this graph looks less nice for demand because we have a lot less power for demand. So that's why I'm showing you the recommendation algorithm version. But directionally, we find exactly the same pattern. And what that means is that we are going to assume that the price coefficient that we actually work with is essentially like a mean price coefficient divided by the manufacturer's suggested retail price for this particular market. And if you're a bit uncomfortable with that, let me also point out that this is essentially identical to using the log price as the characteristic that consumers care about, as opposed to the price in linear terms. We can't actually use the log price because that's going to create a multiplicity of equilibria at the pricing stage, but it amounts to more or less the same thing. Okay, so with pooling out of the way, what is the next big issue we face? The next big issue we face is something called partial observability. Essentially, because of the way my data is structured, I am getting data via one merchant on each product page, right? There is a product page and it might have 7 merchants, but Sangwoo is a merchant who's registered with my data source company, the repricing company. And so I know everything that Sangwoo knows. Sangwoo is informed by Amazon about the prices of everyone and the buy box status of everyone and so on, but Sangwoo certainly isn't informed of Amazon by the sales, about the sales of other players. Sangwoo knows his own sales, but he's not going to be told by Amazon that Gigi just had a sale. That would be competitive information, right? So in particular, I'm going to observe sales for exactly one offer in each market. However, I can also make some additional progress because I observe the total sales. In the following sense, I observe the sales rank of this particular product page. And the sales rank is exactly what you think it is. If you take all products and you rank them by sales, where sales is some discounted average of recent sales, where the discount factor goes larger the further in the past you go. If you rank them by total sales, then that rank that's created, that's your sales rank. And there's been some prior research on this saying that you can more or less proxy total sales using sales rank. It's not great on a predictive performance on a product by product way, but clearly there's information in there, and it's going to be enough information for this sort of big picture structural model. And with this and with my functional form assumption, I am still fully identified and I can estimate demand. So that's the partial observability problem. Okay, 2 problems out of the way: pooling, partial observability. The final problem is that we have here high frequency disaggregate demand data. And this might get a little technical, but for the IO economists among you, the classic way that we estimate demand is using something like the Berry 1994 log transformation, which essentially takes us from the space of market shares into the space of consumer utilities. And once we're in the space of consumer utilities, the world is nice because consumer utilities have this linear structure where then we can, for instance, instrument to avoid endogeneity bias. However, here, my market shares look as follows: 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, right? Because for most product pages on a given day, there is at most one sale. So this log transformation doesn't work from a pure mechanical perspective because log of 0 is negative infinity, and that makes no sense. But from a more sort of abstract perspective, what's going on is that we assume that the market shares are going to be good proxies for purchase probabilities when we make this log transformation. And here, that's just not the case. So what can we do? Well, a usual thing to do would be to aggregate and just say, okay, instead of looking at it day by day, just look at it over the whole year. Well, the problem here is that prices actually vary a lot day by day. And aggregation is going to yield measurement error, which is going to yield attenuation bias unless I have a very good instrument for prices, which here I don't. So I'm going to instead proceed using maximum likelihood estimation. Now, if I do this, I have to talk about endogeneity. So what's the endogeneity concern we usually have, and how do I address it here? So usually we are worried about the endogeneity of product quality. Think about people making a decision to buy a car. For instance, they could be deciding between a Ferrari and a Honda Civic. Now, some people buy the Ferrari, even though it's extremely pricey. And that might lead you, if you're naive, to conclude, okay, people just don't care about price that much. But if you dig more into it, you realize actually the Ferrari differs in some unobservable ways from the Honda Civic, right? It's faster, it's sort of, maybe has more status associated with it and so on. So that means that you have these unobserved product characteristics that are going to matter. And that's why you can't usually just run, for instance, a linear regression. Now, here we don't have this concern because the market is a product page. Think a UPC code. So a market would never pool offers for both a Ferrari and a Honda Civic. A market would just be various offers for this specific kind of Ferrari, right? So that means that the unobserved product characteristics are all going to cancel in this choice. So that's really going to allow us to make a lot of leeway on endogeneity. However, at this point, you might say, and I think this is a good comment, a good criticism. Look, Leon, you're just playing word games with me because endogeneity of product quality might not matter because you've defined a market to be a product, but the endogeneity of offer quality will still matter. And the endogeneity of offer quality is a potential concern. However, what I do have is I have various markers of observable quality, right? So there might be unobservable quality components, like how much do you trust this particular seller, an inference that you make from the name of the seller or something. But there's also observable quality components, like how fast does this offer ship? And what we're going to do is we're going to look at this observable quality components in this table over here, and we're going to look what fraction of observable quality is explained by offer fixed effects. So what fraction is explained by the cross-section as opposed to the time dimension? And we see that this fraction is extremely high, from 95% to 100%. So that suggests that observable quality is time invariant. And that hopefully helps you believe that plausibly unobservable quality might also be time invariant. And if unobservable quality is time invariant, then we can employ offer fixed effects to address our potential endogeneity concern here. So just to be clear, what does that mean for the identifying variation that we're actually using? We are going to use very short-term price variation, right? We're going to use the sort of price variation where I changed my price from today to tomorrow. And that's very different from the price variation we usually use in industrial organization studies, where we typically use either cross-sectional price variation or extremely long run from year to year price variation. And those prices are potentially very endogenous because, plausibly sellers get it right on average or in the long run. But from day to day, here, there is quite a lot of price variation. It's driven by repricing tools, that's driven by maybe experiments in the data. So this short-run price variation should plausibly be exogenous. So again, an identifying assumption is going to be that these unobserved components don't have a time dimension. So the T subscript is dropped here. Now, this gets us, yes?
So if there's an Amazon brand effect that's already covered in the unobserved product characteristic or the Amazon observable characteristic.
Yeah, so the Amazon brand effect actually is sort of on the observable because I know whether an offer is Amazon or not. But this allows even more generally for, I don't know, maybe the Sangwoo brand effect, right? I don't allow these effects to vary over time.
Okay.
Or from day to day. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. So we have to dive a little bit deeper into the weeds because we still have an issue. I told you that we're going to use maximum likelihood to estimate this thing. And then I told you we're going to use offer fixed effects to deal with endogeneity. But offer fixed effects, well, there's going to be a lot of them. And we can't actually do a maximum likelihood estimation with that many offer fixed effects. So let us delve briefly into what I call the incidental parameter problem. So what we're going to want to do is we'll want to get rid of the offer fixed effects and estimation somehow, right? We don't need to estimate them. We just want to control for them. So what we're going to do is we're going to use some logic tricks. We're essentially going to suppress, let's start by suppressing the product page subscript P, and then introduce this dummy yj tau as a dummy for being recommended. And then what we can do is we can evaluate this probability that alternative J is recommended on date tau, conditional on J being recommended either on the first date or the second date, and K being recommended whenever J isn't on these two dates. So that's just a conditioning set, right? I can condition on this in the data just as well as I can condition on it in theory. And if you run through the math, it turns out that if you do this conditioning, you're going to get a double difference in this probability. And this double difference, crucially, does not depend anymore on these fixed effects, the Xi-JRs. And so what we've done is essentially we've conditioned out the fixed effect. So we've created an actually feasible estimate out of this infeasible estimator by using our knowledge of logic probabilities. And this is sort of a slight extension of Rash 1960, 1961. They essentially use one difference and we do a double difference, which is sort of reminiscent of difference in differences estimation. I think unless there is demand, I'm probably going to skip this one. We can basically do the same thing in demand in consumer choice estimation, but it gets a little bit harder because actually what I did here is look, I conditioned on whether on 2 days And on one day, J was recommended. On the other day, K was recommended. Now in demand, I told you I have partial observability problem. So I only know for a given date whether J was sold or not. And I don't know whether K was sold or not. So it turns out, essentially high level, what we do here is we can condition on days where none of the characteristics, including prices, change for the other offers. And then we get to a similar situation, but it just requires a little bit more work. If you're more interested, I can maybe come back to that later, but I think it's going to get us a bit too much into the weeds. Because after all this discussion of identification, I mean, what were you expecting? It is an I/O talk. We do have to talk about identification for like 15 minutes at least. But after all of this discussion, I think it is time for some results. So this is the key table for the recommendation system. So there is quite a few specifications here. Let's just focus on specifications 4 and 5, which are sort of the most advanced key specifications. And the first thing I want you to notice is that I talked a lot about these offer fixed effects, and I'm using them in column 5. Once I use offer fixed effects, I of course can't estimate separately the effects of all of these covariates, which don't vary that much within an offer. And what is the key takeaway from this offer fixed effects column here is the price elasticity. And the price elasticity is, sorry, the inside price coefficient. It's not an elasticity. I should be careful. It's just a coefficient here. It's around minus 8.44. And then I can do the same thing over here without using offer fixed effects, with just using random effects. And that maybe gives me a bit more power. And it gives me more power, but you might have an endogeneity concern. So you want to check and compare these two coefficients here, and you see that actually there doesn't seem to be a major endogeneity concern here. So after I spent all this time discussing, how to address endogeneity, well, it allowed us to estimate column 5, but now we're going to ignore column 5 because there doesn't seem to be endogeneity in the data. It was important to verify. So now let's focus on column 4. In column 4, the key takeaway is the price elasticity. These minus 18.9, that's the price elasticity of the recommendation system. So if you increase your price by 1%, you lose recommendation share on the order of 19%. So this is extremely price elastic, right? At least compared to humans, which I guess is somewhat unsurprising. Humans have a hard time sustaining very high price elasticity, but algorithms, of course, are going to be a lot better at that. And then we can look at various other characteristics, like shipping 1 day slower is equivalent to being 9% pricier, and being an Amazon offer is equivalent to being around 9% cheaper. And then finally, I told you this is a nested logit, so we should check, does it actually make sense to nest this? And yes, the nesting factor here, 0.31. So this is specified in such a way that if it was 1, then there would be no nesting. We could reject the null of nesting. And so here we see that it's quite clear there is nesting going on. Great. So these are recommendations. What about consumer choice? Now, consumer choice results. Let me start by saying, again, we did this offer fixed effect thing. And again, they have no impact. But if you're searching for that in this table here, it's not there. If you ask me to, I will click on that link. The table just gets very big with a lot of details. But basically, endogeneity, also don't worry about it here. We checked. And so this table is going to assume random effects as well. Now, what about quality? Here we see that quality counts. There is a strong Amazon preference, and there is significant variation in quality across offers. So this coefficient on the random effect is precisely estimated and very large. But the main takeaway from this table actually is about defaults. In particular, remember I told you about this parameter rho. And rho measured what fraction of consumers are sophisticated. So 1 minus rho measures the fraction that is naive, that is the fraction that only considers the recommended offer. And here what we see is that in our preferred specification, around 74% of consumers are sophisticated, so 26% of consumers are naive and will consider only the recommended offer and no alternative. And I'm going to give you 2 elasticities to help you assess what that actually means. The first elasticity is the price elasticity of consumer choice if I were to fix recommendations at where they are in the data. And if I were to fix recommendations, then consumers would have a price elasticity of around -3. Now, That's a reasonable elasticity, I think. That's sort of what you find in online contexts, maybe a little bit on the low end. But what's actually interesting is what happens if I allow the recommendations to vary with prices, right? Because we just estimated that for 26% of consumers, they will only consider recommended offers, and recommended offers are now going to change with prices. And so what we see is that the recommendation algorithm increases the price elasticity of consumers from around -3 to around -4. So effectively, it helps the consumers act in a more price elastic way. And that's, of course, going to have implications for the pricing stage, right? When consumers are more price elastic, there's going to be more aggressive price competition and prices are going to drop.
Sorry, I'm a little bit lost here. So what do you mean by recommendations vary? Vary by people?
No. Recommendations vary when prices change. So here I'm shutting down. You can think of this as the partial derivative of the recommendation share with respect to prices. That partial derivative, of course, makes an appearance in this elasticity computation, right? Because market shares are influenced by recommendations. So as you change prices, market shares change partially because recommendations change. And basically, I'm setting that partial derivative to 0 in this first elasticity. So it's sort of something I concocted just so that you can get an understanding of what the impact is of recommendations. Yeah.
Okay.
Awesome. Okay, so that is demand and consumer choice. Now we have to talk a little bit about wholesale and fixed costs. And essentially, entry and profits are going to depend on both fixed costs and wholesale costs, right? Entry is going to depend on fixed costs, profits are going to depend on wholesale costs and pricing decisions too. However, here's a bit of an issue. We have a selective entry model. I was very excited about this a couple of slides back, right? I said, okay, in our entry model, you're making an entry decision based on your cost drop. So that allows us to sort of see how does the mix of entrants change when we make, for instance, the recommendation algorithm more price elastic. But the problem is that with a selective entry model, we can't just invert prices to costs using the pricing first order condition and be done with it. Why can't we do that? Well, that would give us a nice non-parametric estimates of the cost distribution for the successful entrants. But of course, the successful entrants and the potential entrants are not the same thing in a selective entry model. So instead of doing this nice, easy first order condition inversion, what we're going to have to do is we will have to parameterize the whole model and simulate it using a simulated method of moments procedure, essentially match it to the data. So what do? We're going to use, basically, let's build it up from the bottom. So the first thing we have to simulate is pricing games. We can use this modern Morris-Gerlos iteration to solve the pricing games. That's just like a very fast fixed point iteration version of the standard Barry Levinson-Parkes fixed point iteration that allows us to solve these pricing games relatively fast. Then we're going to use a grid search to solve the entry game. So let me give you the intuition for that. Essentially, the entry game is going to look for this cost cutoff, right? Market by market, we need to know what is the cost cutoff below which you enter. And we can use the following observation. If for a potential cost cutoff, we can calculate what would happen on average if everyone entered below that cost cutoff and you, who are exactly at that cost cutoff, also enter. And it must be true at the true cost cutoff that your expected gross profit from entering at that cutoff must be exactly equal to the fixed cost that it costs to enter that market. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a grid search over potential cost cutoffs for each market. Then we have a little bit of an estimation problem because entry is discontinuous, right? Essentially, depending on your draw, you either enter or you don't enter. And that is completely fine for humans, but for the computer, the derivative of the objective function is going to be 0 everywhere because it's just, almost everywhere, because there's just going to be discontinuous jumps. And the computer has a really hard time dealing with that. So instead, we're going to use importance sampling to smooth entry. And this is sort of like a trick a la Ackerberg 2009 to make the objective function smooth by re-weighting based on sort of probability weights. Finally, the objective function is still not that well behaved. So we use this sort of modern optimization algorithm. It's called DFOLS. It's a very good optimization algorithm. I would recommend it. Okay, anyhow, that's how we actually do the simulation. Now, how do we actually match our model to the data? Why is it identified? Well, let's start with the entrant distribution. The entrant distribution is clearly going to be informative about fixed costs, right? Imagine there is only ever one player who enters on all the markets. Well, then we know that the fixed cost must be between the monopoly profits on those markets and the duopoly profits on those markets. And similarly, with the whole entry distribution, we can use moments such as the mean number of entrants, the variance in the number of entrants in the cross-section, and the covariance with various characteristics such as market size. And if we take these moments, they're going to be informative about how fixed cost varies with these things as well. And so that's what we do. And then finally, the price distribution is going to be informative about wholesale costs. Why is that? Well, here the intuition really is rather straightforward. Remember, I told you can't just invert price to costs, but it's almost the same thing, right? Conditional on knowing who the entrants are, you can invert price to costs. And then jointly, this is going to identify also the potential entrants cost distribution, at least up to the level where there's going to be some probability of entering, right? So the one caveat here is that if someone is so inefficient that he would never enter, then across the cross-section, then of course I don't know their cost draw, but also plausibly they wouldn't enter in my counterfactuals, so that's not going to affect my counterfactuals. Now, rather than look at the detailed results, I think we should at least start with just the general model fit. So here I'm showing you the distribution, so this histograms, the distribution of the number of entrants across products in the data, that's in light brown, and in the model, that's in light blue. And we basically see that these two match up reasonably well. The data has sort of an excess mass at the top because it's censored at the top. So there are some markets that have more than 15 entrants, and we code them as 15 entrants. But other than that, this seems to match reasonably well. Now, the price distribution, we can do the same thing, and it matches even nicer, right? So that is mostly because the manufacturer suggested retail price really nicely disciplines what the price level should be across markets. So products that have a high manufacturer suggested retail price should have high prices on average because costs are high on average. And that's exactly what allows us to fit this really nicely. So let's see. I think we have enough time for me to just briefly click on this detailed results button here and to tell you a little bit about the distributional assumptions I make. Essentially, I am assuming that the marginal costs are log normally distributed and they're allowed to vary just with the manufacturer suggested retail price. So that's what I just told you. Manufacturer suggested retail price really nicely disciplines this. Now, the fixed costs are also log normally distributed, and they're allowed to vary with both the market size and with the manufacturer suggested retail price. And the fixed costs that we estimate, remember, this is sort of the costs of adding products to the assortment. It's not properly the cost of starting to sell on Amazon because we're treating these entry decisions across products as separate. The costs that we estimate are on average $100 per month, which seems vaguely plausible. It's hard to compare to anything. We can look at the average merchant revenue, which is around $120 per month. So that seems somewhat plausible that they would be on the same order. And they're relatively tightly distributed, and they increase for products that have a higher manufacturer suggested retail price, perhaps because the products are bigger, you have to store them somewhere, or there's more sort of quality and compliance things that you have to worry about. Wholesale costs are on average estimated to be around 60% of the manufacturer suggested retail price, plus 90 cents. Okay, and that sounds vaguely plausible to me. Of course, wholesale costs are going to be a lot cheaper. Keep in mind, though, there still is a sort of margin in terms of what you pay to Amazon also to be considered here on top of this. So after all of these results, then let's go to the counterfactuals, unless you still have questions about the empirical estimates first, in which case, please interrupt me now. Perfect. So in that case, let's go to the counterfactuals, right? So this is, we've eaten our vegetables, we've dealt with identification and estimation. Now we get to dessert, now we get to the counterfactuals. So there is two counterfactuals I want to run with you today. And the first one really is the effect of self-preferencing. So the question I want to ask here is, how do outcomes change due to self-preferencing? And just to be clear, how am I operationalizing this? In the model, remember, I had these characteristics, offer level characteristics, XJT. And that was a vector. And one of the things it contained was a dummy for whether an offer is owned by Amazon, right? And that Amazon dummy, we estimated a coefficient on it, both for consumer choice and for demand. And for recommendations. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to compute the change in outcomes in going from a world where I shut down that dummy by just putting the coefficient on it to 0, change from going from that world to a new world in which I leave the coefficient on the dummy as it is. So we're going from a world without self-preferencing to a world with self-preferencing. And we want to look at how do things change as we make that transition. And a couple of caveats before I discuss the results. The first one is I have extrapolated everything here sort of naively by revenue to give us numbers that are on the scale of what if my estimates held for all of Amazon. My estimates aren't for all of Amazon. They're just for these 10,000 fashion products. So to the extent that, you know, fashion might be different than other categories, I might be missing some external validity. So don't take these numbers too seriously. They're more meant to give you an indication of the scale. And the second caveat is that I don't model Amazon as a strategic actor. Now, that might strike you as crazy, but the reason I don't model Amazon as a strategic actor is that I don't understand Amazon's incentives. It is not clear to me that Amazon is just maximizing short-run profits. There seems to be some sort of dynamic objective function that I'm unaware of. It seems very clear from the prices they've set historically, for instance, that they're not maximizing short-run profits. And that means I can't evaluate how they would change their pricing decisions under different scenarios. So I am just going to assume that both their pricing and entry decisions stay fixed in this comparison in the world without and with self-preferencing. So with this caveats out of the way, let's actually discuss the counterfactuals. So in the counterfactuals, I'm going to split the world into 3 bins. In the short run, I'm going to keep prices and entry decisions fixed. In the medium run, I'm going to allow prices to vary, but entry decisions still stay fixed. And in the long run, both prices and entry decisions are going to be allowed to vary. So let's start in the short run, going from a world without self-preferencing to one with self-preferencing. How do outcomes change? Well, the key thing I want to emphasize is that the total consumer surplus I estimate to go up. And that comes exclusively from the naive consumers. Well, of course, it comes from the naive consumers because the only thing that changes in the short run is which offers get recommended. And the sophisticated consumers, they're not impacted by which offers get recommended. So, of course, only the naive consumers are impacted in their utility. But note that for them, the consumer surplus goes up. And this is because consumers, naive consumers at least, seem to prefer Amazon offers to offers by other sellers for the same products. So because they do, it's a good idea to recommend them these Amazon offers more frequently, because that means when they buy them, they are happier, and more often they buy them, right? Because previously, maybe sometimes they were not making a purchase decision because they were not seeing an Amazon offer in this recommended spot. Now, don't take this number on platform fees too seriously. Of course, the platform fees go down, but now there is some Amazon profits that go up, which I don't know about because I don't know Amazon's marginal costs, right? I told you I'm not comfortable understanding their strategic incentives. So I can't invert their prices to marginal costs. So I can't estimate the Amazon profit change, but I'm assuming it's positive. Okay, so that's in the short run. Now, how about in the medium run? One thing you might worry about in the medium run is price matters a little bit less now because something else matters more. Maybe prices by third-party merchants are going to increase. Keep in mind, prices by Amazon, I have not modeled. But what about prices by third-party merchants? Well, they do go up a tiny bit, but really not that much. I mean, enough to sort of hurt the sophisticated consumers a little bit, but this is all within sort of the realm of random evaluation as well. And then finally, what about the long run? Now, this is this theory of harm that we were discussing earlier, right? This theory that self-preferencing may act as a barrier to entry. Now, if self-preferencing were to act as a barrier to entry, we should see a large negative effect down here. Now, we do see a negative effect, and in a way that's almost baked into the model, right? This number needs to be weakly negative. That's the only thing that makes theoretical sense. But we see that it's very small. In fact, these markets I showed you 2 slides ago, that's the distribution of the number of merchants on it. So it's maybe like 6 or 7 on average. I think it's 6 point something on average. So minus 0.01 merchants, that's a really tiny effect. So we see essentially no barrier to entry. Perfect. And I think I already told you about the 3 effects, but just to recap, consumer surplus goes up for naive consumers in the short run, prices go up slightly in the medium run, and there's a tiny entry effect in the long run.
Oh, can I ask you a quick question? Why is price going up in the medium run for the third-party sellers after Amazon self-preferencing?
Right.
I think that it's gonna go down actually because yeah, I actually thought about Amazon's private brands gonna put some pressure on the third-party sellers.
Well, I think no.
So usually
it depends a lot on the prices, right? It depends a lot on what the prices are to start out with. Essentially, the way I think about it is now something that isn't price matters to allocation. So price matters relatively less.
Okay, so because customers become less price elasticity, so they're gonna increase the price.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you see the data whether Amazon products are usually cheaper than their competitor products or usually more expensive?
Amazon products are usually cheaper.
Yeah. Okay.
But I'm not sure that that's how, I mean, they previously were also already cheaper, right? So in a world where I just care about price,
yeah,
Amazon products were already putting this pricing pressure on other products. So the self-preferencing doesn't add to that pricing pressure. In fact, I think it takes some off because now when you're losing to Amazon, it's not because your price is so high, but it is because Amazon's just got an advantage. I will say this number I would read as pretty much a 0. I wouldn't overinterpret this as like, this is not a large change. We'll see in a second what is a large change. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, great. So let's move to the second and last counterfactual. And this is the overall effect of search guidance. Now, let me take that back a little bit. When I say overall effect of search guidance, I do only mean this one specific search guidance algorithm. So the overall effect of search guidance for sure is going to have larger numbers everywhere, right? Because the search algorithm, for instance, affects things a lot. This is just for the buy box. And the second thing is that here what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare the currently estimated algorithm to a no recommendation baseline. And then I have a tough job because I need to work out what does it mean for there to be a no recommendation baseline. So what I'm going to do is I will assume that these naive consumers, which were previously only considering a recommended offer, these naive consumers, they're now going to consider a random offer. So that comes down in a very reduced form way as a search model with infinite search costs, essentially, right? They can consider the first offer for free, and any additional offers have infinite search costs. So you might think that actually, if there was no recommendations, the consumers would search a bit more, and then you should temper my estimates down a little bit and think, you know, they're going to be a somewhat less extreme. Directionally, they're going to be the same, but they're going to be somewhat less extreme. Now, with that caveat in mind, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go from a world with no recommendations to a world with recommendations, so random or no recommendations, to the recommendations as estimated in the data. And I'm again going to assess the impact in the short run, in the medium run, and in the long run. Now, in the short run, the platform really is able to achieve its holy trifecta of increasing platform fees, consumer surplus, and producer surplus. And why is that? Well, the only thing that changes is that consumers are now able, naive consumers that is, are now able to see the offers that they actually want to consider, right? It turns out that on platforms such as Amazon, there are a lot of uncompetitive offers that either ship very slow or that are priced very badly. And if you just consider a random offer, that's really bad for you as a consumer, because you're going to look at a random offer and you're going to say, well, I'm not going to buy this. And then your welfare is going to go down. The platform doesn't make any intermediation fees because there was no sale, and the producer makes no sale. So introducing the recommendation algorithm here in the short run, it's really great for everyone. And that's maybe one of the things I wanted to emphasize with this paper, is that we're now already in the world where we're talking about regulating these algorithms. But the first thing to note is that these algorithms create a lot of welfare, because consumer search, it's really important to welfare. Okay, but keeping that in mind, let's move to the medium run. In the medium run, I'm going to allow prices to vary. And remember that when I gave you these consumer choice estimates, I showed you that due to recommendations, in the medium run, the recommendation system makes consumers quite a bit more price elastic. And because they're more price elastic, the merchants are going to have to lower their prices, right? Price competition intensifies in the medium run because of these recommendations. And that means that consumer surplus goes up even more. Consumers love this, right? They sort of like being forced to be a bit more price sensitive, because this is like, in a way, a classic prisoner's dilemma. Like, I would like to be super price sensitive, but if no one, I would like everyone to be super price sensitive, because then prices go down. But on my own, I'm not going to affect pricing. And so on my own, it makes no sense. So turns out this algorithm, the recommendation algorithm, easily institutionalizes this really high price sensitivity. And that is great for consumers. Now, who is it not so great for? Well, producers, because they have to lower their prices. And they make a lot of losses because they have to lower their prices so much. And now an interesting twist here is that actually, who else is it not so good for? Well, the platform, because the platform makes intermediation fees as a fraction of the prices, right? So if sales don't go up to compensate the lowered prices, then the revenue has still gone down a little bit. And that's what we see here. Now, how about in the long run? Well, in the long run, you've got responses to this fact that the producer surplus went down so much. What are you going to do if you're a merchant and you're considering entering on this platform and well, it's really tough to be an entrant on this platform? Well, you're not going to enter. So what we're going to see is that the mean number of entrants per market is going to go down on the order of 2 merchants less per market. Now, this is actually a large number, right? That's about 30% of the average number of entrants we see. So that is going to somewhat temper the price decrease, although not that much. The price decrease is still easily driven when there's like 3 or 4 merchants on a market. But mostly, it's going to reduce the consumer surplus, because for sophisticated consumers, one of the big things about Amazon was that there were various offers, and they liked to pick and choose between these various offers. Maybe they wanted faster shipping. Maybe today they wanted a cheaper offer. And now they can't benefit from this as much because the number of merchants has gone down. Now, here's a bit of a caveat that comes from the entry model. I was discussing, when we were discussing the entry model, I was mentioning how one sort of limitation of the entry model is that we have selection on cost, but we do not have selection on quality. And because we don't have selection on quality, the entrants that we lose here, these 2.12, they're average or like random draws across the quality distribution. And that means this effect here, the negative effect, might be slightly overestimated, right? Because really these should be marginal draws across the quality distribution, and marginal draws are going to be sort of worse quality. So we're going to lose worse quality entrants than this model suggests. So just to keep in mind, maybe I'm overstating the entry effect a little bit here. But essentially, what's the conclusion from this? Well, showing attractive offers is good for everyone in the short run, but it induces falling prices in the medium run and lower entry in the long run. So one way I like to interpret this is, you know, in regulation, we often talk about these e-commerce platforms as if they're these massive platforms that can just do whatever they want because they have monopoly power. But these platforms face demand curves on both sides. They have to not only convince consumers to join, they also have to convince merchants to join. And that constrains their behavior, right? You might think that these platforms want to extract all the surplus from merchants. Sure they do, but if they literally did that, then none of the merchants would join the platforms. So there is sort of the two-sidedness that really matters a lot here. Okay, and then with, I think, plenty of time, let me come to my conclusion with three main takeaways. So the first one is that defaults matter and intermediation power is real. So we have seen today that consumers really are influenced by this buy box algorithm. And just to flag, if anything, I think I might be underestimating the impact that the buy box algorithm has on consumer choice because of various sort of choices I make along the way. When estimating it, I was worried people would be claiming that consumers are rational and so they should be ignoring this buy box algorithm. So I want to be robust against this defense. And in doing so, I estimate what I consider to be a lower bound on the influence of the buy box algorithm. So we really find that even with this lower bound, 26% of consumers only consider recommended offers. It really seems that intermediation power is real. These platforms can influence consumer choice. And that means careful monitoring of algorithms shaping market outcomes is and will remain crucial. Now, if you're a business, I think the main takeaway from this presentation is that short run and long run impact are not the same when it comes to recommendations, right? If you ran a short run A/B test on various buy box algorithms, you would always find that, make it more price elastic, because consumers, they're going to buy more. And as long as prices stay fixed, the merchants are not going to leave, and then it's going to be great. But then you're going to implement it, and 2 years down the line, you will see that all the merchants have left your platform. So the lesson here is to supplement short-run A/B tests with either modeling like I've done in this presentation or long-run tests, right? So for instance, I've seen that Facebook Marketplace, they now sometimes run tests that take years, and they're sort of, a year-long holdout. And then if they see, oh, in this year-long holdout, no merchant has left, but when we implemented our fancy new recommendation algorithm, we lost 10% of merchants, then they can see it even in the experiment without modeling. Finally, if you're a regulator, note that self-preferencing, at least the way I have defined it today, can be welfare enhancing, which if you define it differently, maybe just keep in mind that basically when the recommendation algorithm recommends the platform a lot, maybe that is because consumers prefer to buy the platform's own offers. And in that world, that's a good thing. When consumers prefer to buy the platform's own offers, you should be recommending them these offers frequently. And so it's very hard without a proper analysis of, in particular, consumer preferences to decide what the appropriate regulation is. And the appropriate regulation may vary platform by platform because consumers' strength of preferences for the platform's products might vary platform by platform. Now, in future research, I am extremely interested in working on what I would call paying for recommendations, and other people might call sponsored search or sponsored search guidance, because this is an obvious way that these platforms can monetize their ability to guide consumer search. And at the same time, it is a way where I worry that one of the big boons from these e-commerce platforms has been the lowering of consumer search costs, the additional price comparison, and thereby additional competitive pressure on merchants to keep their prices low. But if a merchant can choose to either price aggressively or to spend that additional money on being featured on the merchants or on the e-commerce platform, then I worry that this might have negative implications for welfare. And with that, I'm going to leave you and say thank you all for listening to this very long talk. And please do let me know if you have any further questions. Thank you very much.
Hi, Leon. Thank you.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. This is Yingju from Luohan, and I have a question. At first, I want to point out that I think the point you make about the two-side constraint of platform, that's, I think, a very we feel sympathy of that because we observe how platforms deal with difficulties, this kind of difficult all the time. And I think I'm glad to hear that someone finally pointed out. And also, in terms of I think one key assumption of this model is the naive, the proportion of the naive consumers. And I like to think about inversely. For example, if we really think about the business reason of why Amazon or other platform like Taobao want to do some retail business, I think one important reason is that they want to keep their customer happy in terms of if they sell it themselves, they can control the quality, they can control the customer service better. And if those products are what their customers bought very frequently, they may prefer to do this more. In terms of this, I think it's very important that if we look at different markets, different products, the preference of the platform to do a self-retail is very different. For example, for those products which are very diverse demand and very low frequency, maybe the platform doesn't want to do the self-privacy. In terms of this, how about if you think about that for different products, you have different proportion of naive consumers. Therefore, the value or the benefit from self-privacy or algorithm are different across different markets. I think that's will make the model much more attractive. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent idea. So I actually have that on a list in this. So I can tell you right now that it's if I had infinite data, this is an easy drop-in to the way I estimated. I can very easily, I can let theoretically, I can literally vary it product page by product page, but I can definitely vary it by some other characteristic of the market, like for instance, frequency of repeat purchases, if I had data on that. In practice, I am a little worried about power with the data I have. There might not be enough to really precisely identify that coefficient, but it's definitely something I'm going to study. And I really like your reasoning behind it, saying that, it might vary product by product because of sort of also the fact that the platform's incentives come through these repeat purchases. I think that's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello, Liam.
Hi.
Could you turn back to page 21?
21. This one?
Yeah, I have a question regarding the importance sampling. May I know how do you implement this? Do you use the initial set or parameters? Initial value of the parameters?
Do I use the initial value of the parameters? So it gets updated along the way, right? So yeah. So it's like, so technically the SMM is sort of two stages. There's like an outer loop and there's an inner loop. And in the inner loop, the parameters are fixed and we just go through the importance sampling weights. And then when the outer loop updates, then we redraw. So it's, I think you worry that I might go far from the initial parameters. Or my worry would be that otherwise I could go far from the initial parameters and the approximation would become poor. But that should be fixed by that outer loop component.
Okay. Do you think this step is essential in the consideration sets estimation?
No, sorry. This doesn't happen for consideration sets or anything like that. It's just for the entry games. So everything up to here is just estimated using usual maximum likelihood. There is no importance sampling or anything like that. And then here I add the importance sampling for when I run the simulated method of moments that just identifies the fixed and wholesale costs. And for those, it's important just because the entry game is discontinuous. Otherwise, I wouldn't have added it. But with a discontinuous game, you have to smooth things out to have the computer help the computer along.
Oh, okay, sure. Thanks.
Any other question? You think it's okay. Yeah, if there's no, maybe I can ask you. Actually, have one thing I want to ask.
Sure.
So it's just like the first of the decrease of the customer welfare moving from short run to mid run to long run is from decreasing is from price, right? It's through the channel of the price. mainly from
The-
price.
The decrease in customer welfare, and is this in this counterfactual or?
Yeah, in a counterfactual, no, not in a self-preference.
Oh, in this one. So, I mean, from medium run to long run, it's not about price, it's about number of entrants, right? So,
but if the number of entrants gonna affect customer welfare through, I guess, in this model, the main channel affecting customer welfare is through price, because those products are kind of exactly the same, I guess.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So when we estimate it, we find a very large sort of, well, I call it a random effect, but you can think of it as the standard deviation of the fixed effect. So the standard deviation of the brand preferences.
The reason the reason I'm talking about this is because when you hear about these days about the antitrust issue of the self-preference and all these search guidance is, if, for example, if Amazon doing the self-preference, the main thing they're worried about is that's gonna dampen the innovative products, right?
Right, that's not on here at all.
Yeah,
so that's
So like CJ mentioned it at the beginning, actually, that's not in this model. So I guess it'll be very important to, but I guess actually when Amazon entered, there actually some products are those kind of innovative products, but most of the products are just like products are like those kind of the standardized products, like already there are a lot of the retailers.
I do think this question is really interesting, and it's not in the model at all. The question of sort of dynamic incentives for innovation, and the worry that Amazon might predate you, like predatorily enter the market after you spent the money on innovation.
Actually, the thing it's not about the question, but the thing that came to my head is actually most of the products are like that, like not like innovative products, but just like Amazon is like try to get the product from the same factory with other retailers. Actually, maybe the side effect of this benefit would be very small, maybe smaller than people are worried about. Yeah.
Oh, you're saying because most products are not innovative in this way, you are suggesting that the dynamic effect on innovation is actually relatively small compared to what I'm estimating. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Kind of compared to what people are usually worried about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's plausible. I will say I just don't have the data to look at that. You would really want to look at product entries over time to look at that.
So you have any idea, or have you ever heard about any kind of the math some people are doing, like try to maybe distinguish between those kind of innovative products or kind of those kind of not innovative products, and platform is trying to enter?
Yeah, I don't think I have. The closest thing I can come up with is the competing with complementers paper that you probably know. But that's more on, okay, you know it.
Okay, I got it. Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Any other question? Yeah, it seems like it's done. And thank you very much for your amazing talk, and thanks very much for staying longer to receive the questions. And yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, also thank you audience for staying long nights.
Of course, thank you so much for having me, and thanks everyone for listening and your insightful questions. I'm going to go after this and write down everything that I heard today, because there were some really helpful comments there. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, Leon.